Tēnara tātou katoa, kua hui mai nei rungita wa tangutiwa. My name is Tracy Hopapa and I'm the Chairman of the Federation of Māori Authorities, FOMA, and alongside of Manatu Mo Te Taiao, the Ministry for Environment, we're delighted to have you all join us online for a webinar around the National Planning Framework. The hui today is for ahu whenua, for Māori landowners, land users and land managers to hear from FOMA, from Te Tai Kaha and also from MFE with regards to the National Planning Framework and our role and responsibilities. Thank you for joining us again. What I'd like to do now is to introduce Martin Workman, who is the Acting Deputy Secretary for Māori Rights and Interests, to open our webinar with a karakia. Kei a koe, Martin.
Kia ora, Tracy. Tūtara mai I rongo, tūtara mai I raro, tūtara mai I roto, tūtara mai I waho. Kia tau ai te Māori to te Māori ora ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e.
Thank you, Martin. So today's webinar is a lunchtime webinar because we're making the most of the pause in the day. We will be hearing from Martin. We'll also be hearing from Annette Sykes, our legal advisor, and also technical expert on the resource management reform process and also Māori rights and interests. During the session, we'll be asking you to put your questions, queries or comments in the chat function, and we will respond to your queries in part through the kōrero and through the presentation. And also we will be, if we have some time, taking some questions at the very end. So please feel free to put any thoughts in the chat function. You'll see it running along the bottom of your screen, and we will be in touch with you on that. Just to note too that this webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available for you and your organisations and teams for later on. And we'll also be posting that on the FOMA website and also on our social media. Now, what I'd like to do is pass the session over to Martin Workman for his presentation on the National Planning Framework. Over to you, Martin.
Kia ora, Tracy. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairapa te iwi, ko Martin Workman toku ingoa, and as Tracy said, I'm just stepping into a new role at Manatu Mo Te Taiao, filling in for Mark Shadbolt leaving last week, and very excited about that, and really excited about opportunity today to be here with FOMA to give you an update on what's been planned around the resource management reforms, and particularly what's been proposed for the first national planning framework that will be a key part of those reforms. Please. So what I'll cover today is a quick overview of what's in the National Planning Framework. So we don't have a lot of time today, but just to give you a taste for that, what its role is in these resource management reforms, some of the key aspects of the first NPF, and really keen to get your feedback on your further, how you'd like to be involved going forward in the process of developing this NPF. And just an advert for the FOMA hui coming up next week in Wellington, and that will have a NPF workshop as part of that. It's another opportunity to be engaging. And before I go further, I should introduce Joe Beaglehole. I've just seen Joe there. Joe's a principal advisor at Manatu Mo Te Taiao as well, and helping on this important mahi. And just as Tracy said, really encourage you to ask any questions as we go, and Joe's going to be there helping me answer them through today's hui. Hi, please. So the role of the National Planning Framework in the new system that we're moving to, so the government is going through this process of reforming replacing the Resource Management Act. And key to that is two new bills that are currently before the Select Committee, the Natural and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill. And these will give direction when they're complete on how the new system will work. And a key part of giving that direction will be through the National Planning Framework, which will sit under the bill, and that will give direction to these new decision-making bodies called regional planning committees that will be developing first the regional spatial strategies and then the natural and built environment plans after that. The first version of the National Planning Framework is really targeting these regional spatial strategies. And their purpose is to principally to be setting out long-term strategic plans for regions and how future development is going to take place in those regions. So as most of you probably have heard, for these reforms is looking at how we better provide affordable housing and also infrastructure for our people and communities, so that they have more affordable and appropriate places to live. And in doing that, we want to make sure that those high-level regional spatial strategies have all the right information that's available to also set out where the constraints for that development to occur are well known, so that these first regional spatial strategies can be, best take that into account. And at the high level for these reforms, the dual objective is to better protect our te taiao, at the same time as how do we provide for provide for the necessary development, such as affordable housing and crucial infrastructure, and deliver on both those things. And the National Planning Framework is a key part of giving direction on how local communities and the planning committees are going to go through that. And I guess the other key point in these reforms is that there's a number of things that strengthen the te tiriti considerations through the future system. And part of that is that all decision makers are required to give effect to the principles of te tiriti in coming up with these regional spatial strategies, the consent and the MBE plans. Right, I think go to the next slide, please. Next slide shows the pathway for the overall transition to this new system. And as I've set out in the next, by the middle of this year, all going to plan, the two bills will be passed through Parliament. And you can see a third bill is also noted there, the Climate Adaptation Bill, that's on a slightly longer time frame. And the first MPF is being developed, and that will be in place by end of 24 in order to feed into the regional planning committee's decisions on those regional spatial strategies and plans that I talked about. And this, as you can see, the development process, it takes quite some time. It's up at 10 years to get these new plans and those regulatory tools to actually take effect. So that's quite some time. And therefore, you can see at the bottom of the slide, the current RMA system continues in the meantime until those MBE plans come into effect, so that we have the right controls, management levers in place in the meantime as we go through this transition. Go to the next slide, please. And please if any questions, please use the Q&As, I think, or there's a Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of the screen there. So feel free to be using that. So key dates for this first development of national planning. Really want to acknowledge how tight these timeframes are, and that there's a lot going on, especially in the rural sector. So acknowledging this is yet another thing coming your way, and so to explain why that is. So the bill's still to be passed, but we're developing this first national planning framework, and the minister has been very keen that he's concerned about that length of the 10-year transition period, and really wanting to make sure that we have the national planning framework in place as soon as possible in order to be giving direction for how regional planning committees and committees are developing both the regional planning spatial strategies and their plans. Under the RMA, there was a real sort of lack of any national direction, and it was sort of left to councils, and there was a real mixed it didn't deliver what the RMA was set out to deliver. So part of the attempt to fix that and address that is to have national direction through the national planning framework in place as quickly as possible. So hence this tight time frame. So we're out engaging over the next month, and then taking some advice to ministers, and then it'll be a cabinet decision around the mid-2023 as to what that first version of the national planning framework will be that gets proposed publicly for public submissions, which we're expecting around August. And then there'll be a board of inquiry process, so that will have formal hearings of submissions, and that board will make recommendations to the government before the end of 2024, so that it can come into place at that time, and then there is clear direction for the new system around the regional spatial strategies. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so there's a lot on the screen, which is appropriate because it's demonstrating what will be in the first national planning framework, and there's a lot that will be included. And the majority of it is the existing that is in place under the RMA. And so a big part of this content that you can see here is bringing that RMA national direction with some technical changes to update it for the new system, but bringing largely that policy intent that's contained in there through to this first version of the national planning framework. And so the likes of freshwater there, the national policy statement for freshwater, it will be brought over into this national planning framework pretty much intact. There'll be some wording changes that will make it compatible with the new system, such as it's not going to be tasking regional councils for doing certain tasks. It's going to be tasking regional planning committees to be doing those things. But most importantly, the korowai of Te Manawa Te Wai is going to be brought over intact into the new system. And that's, a really important direction from the minister, and what we've heard from a lot of Māori in particular is to make sure that's gone before, and that the work that councils are doing in the meantime, such as on their freshwater plans that need to be notified by the end of 2024, that they can flow through to the new system, and all that good work that is hopefully going on in that development is not lost. So that's a big part of this first national planning framework. And that goes to urban development, the coastal and marine area, biodiversity. So the intent still, ministers to make decisions around the national policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity, but the intent is that that will be there, if not in the first national planning framework, then in later versions. That the second MPF, we're expecting sometime around end of 2026 for that to come into play. So a really important feature of the national planning framework is this overarching layer that you can see at the top of this diagram. And a key reason why we are having a national planning framework under the new system is to move towards far more integrated national direction, rather than having these 20-odd instruments developed in quite an ad hoc way, and not talking to one another all the time. And so this first MPF, given the timeframes we're working to, isn't going to deliver the silver bullet of having a total integrated approach, but we will be trying our best to head in that direction. And part of that in the overarching layer is trying to capture some of the common principles that we're wanting to apply across the whole document in all these different domains or chapters that you can see in the blue ovals there. And some of those areas is around how we deal with conflict between environmental outcomes and between different parts of the national planning framework. And so there's some direction that I'll come to around that. And there's also a real focus that we're proposing to ensure there's clear direction on involvement of Māori in the system and how regional planning committees and councils should be provided. Next slide, please. So on that overarching layer, just as I was laying out what we're looking to cover there, which I think I've already covered. I'm getting ahead of myself. So, and the other key part of that overarching layer is monitoring the performance of the national planning framework and having direction around how that is done, so that we have an ongoing basis for, are we achieving those things that we have set out to achieve as part of these reforms, and the objectives set in the national planning framework, and making sure that that good data and evidence is being built up. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, a key part of that overarching layer is setting these overarching principles, and at the heart of the purpose of the MBE bill is the concept or korowai of te aoranga o te taiao, and what we're looking to provide within the overarching layer is a clear statement as to how regional planning committees deliver on and uphold te aoranga o te taiao, and while managing some of these competing outcomes that we'll come to. But an obvious one is, a real desire to be building crucial infrastructure, to be helping with the rebuild, given the storm events and the damage from the cyclones recently. How do we enable things to be built back in the right place, in the right way? And a key part of that is recognising te aoranga o te taiao and the fundamental importance of the health of the natural environment. And in doing that, the National Planning Framework also contains environmental limits and targets. So having direction that we're prioritising measures that regional planning committees are taking actions to deliver on those environmental limits and targets is a really important priority first. Then within their regional spatial strategies and natural and built environment plans, a key concept through the reforms is to deal with as much of the conflict resolution and planning in these documents so that there's greater certainty and clarity as to where future development can take place and where it's not suitable. As I was saying earlier, around the purpose of the regional spatial strategies. And a key part of that is where are those places for development, make more sense, and take into account important values, be they environmental or cultural, or such things as outstanding landscapes and other constraints, and natural hazards, really importantly, that they're taken into account as to where we're identifying these areas. And where there is development to occur, having a strong emphasis on looking at co-benefits. How can we get development that occurs that does contain multiple benefits, that for both the environment, communities, and for whatever the commercial operation may be or infrastructure development may be. And also direction around taking national interests into account and interregional interests. So this again goes to some things that are really important for us as a country and as lifeline infrastructure that goes across regions. How do we provide for that going forward in an appropriate way? And Transpower power lines and power supply is another crucial one, as the recent storm events have shown. Next slide, please. So as I was saying on the Māori engagement, and a crucial issue I know for FOMA here is how what is required of regional planning committees and local authorities for engaging with Māori groups, and what Māori groups should be engaged with. And so, a crucial thing we've seen in your submissions is that real key role for landowners and local whānau to have their say and ability to be expressing, in their interests in this process. So the bill has a lot of provisions around that regarding how regional planning committees are to be set up, and to recognise a key outcome of the bill that's identified as providing for the relationship of iwi and hapu and their taonga, as well as the interests of other Māori groups throughout the natural and built environment. And so we're looking at ways that there's a baseline of obligation placed on these regional planning committees and decision makers under the new Act, and through the MPF giving consistent direction as to what that looks like and what it may contain. And that goes to ensuring that that there's opportunities for all groups, all Māori groups, to be part of that process. And so we will be, real key area for seeking further input from yourselves as to how best to set this up and to provide that direction. We'll be, really interested in feedback from you on that, to ensure we get that right. And I guess what we're seeing is through the likes of the National Planning Statement for Freshwater had much stronger, clearer direction on what engagement with different Māori groups had to take place. And what we're looking for is bringing that through to the whole national planning framework, so that there's consistency across the environment, not just for freshwater. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, a key part of the national planning framework will be setting out the limits and targets, and we're taking a staged approach to how we develop these. And so the first MPF is going to have a relatively small set of attributes that will sort of be required to be measured, and as indicators for whether we're ensuring that there is no further degradation. But in addition to that, there will be the targets and national bottom lines that are set in the MPS freshwater. They'll come through into this first MPF. But the further development of detailed attributes and targets will occur in subsequent national planning frameworks. The next one, as I said, is probably in 2026. And so that more work to be done. So the first MPF, as you can see in this next slide, sets out what will be the attributes to do or to help measure whether we are maintaining our environment in the first place, just like under the National Planning Policy Statement for Freshwater, but that being applied across other domains such as air, Indigenous biodiversity, coastal and estuaries, and as you can see in that table, some proposed attributes as to what will be measured in order to, in the first instance, in this first MPF, to tell whether we're heading in the right direction or not. So again, undertaking a process, engaging with a scientific Maturanga panel who are giving us advice around these, but again, interested in your views on how this has been approached. And I guess the whole construct of limits and targets is still being considered in the bill, and we've heard loud and clear that there needs to be more clarity and certainty around how those limits and targets will work, and that it's not just about maintaining, the degraded environment we currently have, but there is also a strong driver to see improvements through setting environmental targets that are restoring a lot of our degraded environments will be part of the system going forward. Next slide, please. So I think I've covered a lot of this. This is carrying over the existing Resource Management Act direction, fact that looking for providing continuity for the government. And that I guess the other point was with the RMA continuing while we go through this transition, there is a real need to, in some instances, to be making changes in existing RMA national direction so that there are tougher regulations in some cases and others enabling development in others, or better enabling development, that they come into place in the nearer future. And so the likes of the land use Tairāwhiti inquiry that's going on at the moment, it's, one possible outcome of that is recommendations coming through to such things as the National Environmental Standard for Forestry to address the issues that have been occurring around slash in the storm events and how we manage that going forward, and that those changes are likely to be brought RMA so that they can come into force sooner, and that they would then come through to the future version of the National Planning Framework in the future. But I know that's probably a issue that FOMA members are interested in, so where I can answer some more questions around that, but until we have that inquiry back, obviously there's a lot of water to go under the bridge there. Next slide, please. So a key part, as I've mentioned a few times, is of the National Planning Framework, this first version, is providing some new content direction around how we deal with infrastructure development going forward. And as I said, a key objective is making it covering off in the plans and the regional spatial strategy where this future development takes place, and that it gets identified in the right place. And there's a number of concerns we've heard in submissions from FOMA and others around what this means for Māori land, as far as having designations over your land regarding infrastructure goes in the future. So, this to me is one of the big areas that Māori really need to be looking at carefully, given how infrastructure has been managed in the past, and a real desire from the government to get to a better position for how to provide for it in the future, while achieving the multiple objectives that the reforms have. But there is, in going to the plans and having this infrastructure set out clearly in those, there is, potential for less resource consents and the opportunity to have input in through the consent process, and therefore involvement in things such as the National Planning Framework and regional spatial strategies is really important for how this new system is set up and will operate. So I'll just give the example, that last bullet point there, standards for common infrastructure activity. So Minister Parker really interested in how we drive some efficiencies and what have been really some expensive sort of consenting processes for, and how can we have some standard conditions that apply across the country where there's common activities such as earthworks or effects such as noise generated. How can we make sure, rather than having each region having its own set, where it makes sense, how can we get that consistent and more standardized and easier to get through to a good place in the process? But again, needing close scrutiny that those standards work for Māori as well as for others. Next slide, please. Okay, so other new content that has been introduced is around these areas, and the cultural heritage area again, and so all these are generally focused on how do we give direction as to what those regional spatial strategies are meant to look at and recognise. And so before identifying this is where we think future development should take place, all these things, those 4 items and more, should be getting considered by regional planning committees. And the cultural heritage, we've heard loud and clear from Māori advisory groups the need for a tailored approach to Māori cultural heritage here, for wāhi tapu. It's not just like any other European settler heritage. There is real issues of continuing degradation that has occurred and is occurring, and how do we, through this national direction, make sure we've got good tailored direction that applies for our Māori cultural heritage. So that's an area of detail again that I think is important. Same goes for outstanding natural features and landscapes, and for how we plan in the future for natural hazards and adaptation. And obviously a lot happening in this space with the recent storm events, and planning going on as to how we build back more appropriately in the right places, and join up with what's needed to make that happen. So that will be a big part of this initial national planning, around identifying where these extra natural hazards and the like are, and there'll probably be looking at the possibility of some RMA direction in the meantime, so that again this build back better is enabled or helped through some national direction in the shorter term, which would then flow through to future MPF. And again, on that relationship of iwi and hapu and Māori with their taonga, really, rather than a blanket approach in the national planning framework that says this is how we're approaching this up and down the country, we're proposing that there's a real emphasis on making sure that iwi, hapu, Māori are heard and have that basically drive that at a more local, regional level. We're seeing that as more appropriate, but again, really keen to get people's feedback on that. I'm going to stop there and see where we're getting to with questions and open it up, I think.
Kia ora, Martin. Thanks very much for a comprehensive presentation, and also for giving us a thorough going over in terms of the MPF. We do have a series of questions that have been asked, and just to clear one of them off, David Stevens, this session is being recorded, ihoa, and it will be made available for you all, so check our FOMA social media for that. Martin, before we go into questions, what I'd like to do now is to invite Annette Sykes to give us a presentation from Te Tai Kaha. Kia ora, Martin. From Te Tai Kaha. Te Tai Kaha is Kahui Wai Māori, FOMA, the Federation of Māori Authorities, and the New Zealand Māori Council, working together on all things Māori rights and interests, especially in terms of the Resource Management Planning Act and reform process. Nau mai, Annette, kei a koe nei. Kia ora.
Kia ora no tātou hui mai nei I runga I te epurangi nei. Kei te taitoki ngā mihi ki a koe, ko tau mai kia nei te ringa wera o te manatū o te tai ao. Kei te tautoko ki ngā mihi kia wetahi o tō kaiarahi I hoki atu I rāta nei kāinga, Melanie mā, I runga I tau atu āhuatanga, tēnā koutou. I just want to let everybody know today that I've been privileged to be part of working for the New Zealand Māori Council, unsettled hapu and iwi groups, and the Federation of Māori Authorities. And I want to acknowledge the work of the officials in this particular space who have been working, I think, under really important timeframes and inordinate stress. There's been COVID-19, there's been the cyclones and flooding issues, which have made difficult personal contact with many of Te Ao Māori. So Martin, Joe Bigahole, Mariana, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, Mariana, Pobo Nikofa, who are part of today's webinar, thank you for your assistance. One of the things you will have seen from the slides is that MFE have demonstrated a real willingness through this process to engage with the Federation of Māori Authorities, particularly Māori landowners and New Zealand Māori Council membership. It's really important, though, that where they've landed, and the words are hapu, iwi and Māori, that there's still an invisibilisation of people that I think are really important in our communities who look after and care for our taonga and te taiao. The who in the system has been a key issue for the Federation of Māori authorities itself. It would be nice if we'd had the same kind of approach as in Te Mana o Te Wai, where those that are expressed there are those that possess mana whakahaere, that is, those that have power and authority at place, which for me is an inclusive way of expressing immediate inclusion of Māori land in corporations, trusts and marae, who I think are fundamental in the planning process and accountability processes of planning in communities that most affect Māori. As a consequence, we've expressed their concern about the drafting in the spatial planning and natural and built environmental bills. And of course, they're before Parliament, and our submissions are available on the website. It's no secret, I'm an absolute fundamentalist when it comes to the use of the term mana whakahaere. I've been practicing in the treaty space for a long time, and I don't think that the terms iwi and hapu in our current context are really encompassing of enough to encompass the broad range of rights and interests and responsibilities holders. I'm supported in that view if you've been watching any case law recently by some of the statements in the Supreme Court in relation to claims by the Wairarapa Moana Incorporation. I know I've got many of you on listening. You will see that Justice Williams and the Chief Justice herself says that we needed to have a much more flexible and adaptive approach rather than just using the language of iwi and hapu. I just want to remind everybody, it is in fact the term hapu that is expressed in Te Tiriti, in fact in the preamble to Te Tiriti itself, and it is in fact hapu that landowners and trusts are accountable to. I think just as a general observation on the slide, Martin, around Te Oranga o Te Taiao, we've advocated strongly, as we did in Te Mana o Te Wai, for a hierarchy of obligations to be implicit in the way that Te Oranga o Te Taiao is to be interpreted and then applied. And we've also made submissions on that. The presentation, and I want to thank you, Martin, for it, highlights the centrality of the National Planning Framework because it gives direction on how the resource management system will work. For many of us who are dinosaurs and working in the system, we are going to have to change some of the language we use, but also the intersection of relationships between regional planning committees and those that I say possess mana whakahaere, or those Māori incorporations, trusts, marae members, kaitiaki of our taonga, iwi and hapu representatives in this space. This is an important opportunity for us to make submissions. I've been watching the submissions. Can I please have some more submissions on this from the Māori landowners, hapu, iwi and marae, and urban Māori who've actually been really active to date. Can I go to the next slide and I'll go to the substance of today's kōrero. One of the key issues for us is the overarching layer, and as Martin has quite eloquently told us, it's giving effect, which is quite a different kaupapa. I saw Donna Gardner, you'd asked the question about taking account. I'm really pleased that the Māori advocacy has achieved, I think, one of the best English expressions of what's required by both those participants in the new National Planning Framework, but also in the committees and in Parliament's expression of this as well, giving effect to Te Tiriti or Waitangi. So it's quite clear that it's the Māori text that we are contemplating, as well have the primary reading and any ambiguity that may arise and its principles. It's a clause that was used in the Education and Training Act, and I think it's really important that we kind of move to this clause in modern legislation. The overarching korowai, as Martin, I think, aptly described, sets out to a direction on how to engage with the full range of Māori rights and interest holders. And this is really important because you will have seen in the slide of the complexity of how the interconnection between the SPA and the MBL bills actually are in practice. And this has consequences for the National Planning Framework. While most of the framework is a rollover, as Martin said, of existing national directions like Te Mana o Te Taiao, or Te Mana o Te Wai, or the National Policy Statement on Coastal Policy, there is new national direction proposed, and I don't want to underestimate what that might mean. This consultation is more about scope than detailed content, so we need to, I think, keep that uppermost in our mind when we're responding to the matters before us and in the period we have left for our submissions. One of the key things we've focused on is how will the monitoring of the national policy framework include input from mana whakahaere, that is those hapu, Māori landowners, rights holders at place who have stood the test of time for us, and how they're going to have an input in both the Board of Inquiry, which is the interim kind of national committee that will have influence in setting the national direction, and until the establishment of what is called a national Māori entity. Its role and functions have yet to be perfectly understood, but under the current process, they will be contemplated as an advisory group to the ministers. We are very conscious of these processes, and we are making submissions vigorously on this, because it's really clear for us that the Board of Inquiry, because it's in place till the end of 2024, will be an important precedent in anything that will follow. So we just need to be conscious of that as we're developing an approach. One of the key, I think, difficulties that we all face as Māori is how can we be inclusive of each other and avoid the mana munching that tends to go hand in hand with our desire to advocate fiercely for those rights and interests we protect, vehemently, because they are part of our whakamapa. So one of the key questions we've posited is how should national direction and guidance provide for inclusive processes for engaging with the full range of Māori rights and interest holders. I struggle with the construct that it's only post-settlements governance entities that will provide us with that level of inclusivity. All of us will know, particularly if we're managing taonga rights, interests in geothermal resources, interests in any geological resources, that the scope of those that are affected by that are much beyond a PSGE. So we need to be really conscious of developing engagement processes that are more participatory of the full range of Māori rights and interest holders. We really need to understand what guidance the regional planning committees will be provided to ensure that they are talking to rights and interest holders. I act for a whole lot of incorporations that get deeply frustrated when, their interests, because they are landowners quite often bordering on water spaces or on coastal areas, are actually being overtaken by trust boards and the like. I particularly want to mention for the northern tribes, there's 110 hapu interests in the Ngāpuhi area. They're unsettled groups, and yet they get frustrated because inevitably there's only small groups of individuals that tend to be engaged with, who are either with Te Runanga o Ngāpuhi or committee arrangements that have been set up for some time by the regional councils themselves. And we're questioning whether in fact there should be some resourcing, some approaches for a much more broader approach to ensure the right interest holders are there. The MBA will include a new outcome on the relationship of iwi and hapu with their taonga. You saw that in their slides today in a number of contexts, but the one I think I'd focus to is the cultural relationships, which are the Section 6E relationships in the current RMA. What will be the national direction on that? I think there was a couple of questions in the chat room today asking us, how is this going to be done to ensure that I assume it wasn't there, but the mana motuhake of rights and interests of hapu, of landowners, are going to be protected in any national direction. I think this is going to be a challenge for us all. I remind, though, he whakaputunga and Te Tiriti contemplated that Māori would come together in the summer to actually create laws for ourselves. So we regionally need to take that opportunity to set the paradigm relationships between ourselves and the kind of parameters of values and principles that will guide participation, not just for our rights and interests, but to ensure the survivability of Te Taiao itself. I think we have to say that in the current state of climate adaptation challenge and the existential climate crisis that we face post-Gabriel, but we've known about for a lot longer. In fact, most of us since Cyclone Bola, if you're from Tairāwhiti. We need to know what are this going to mean for every landowner. We can't just assume that we've got one individual talking for all of us. And we will need to show how the National Planning Framework will offer direction on processes which the policy papers said allow for self-identification. So that's for us to identify who has the mana whakahaere, rather than Crown processes being prescriptive of that. Remembering that post-settlement governance entities are prescribed through a treaty settlement framework, which is quite different in context and form than a number of our own relationships, particularly our selection processes, wahoo whenua trusts and corporations and committee marae. Can I have the next slide, please? MFE have committed to working with Federation of Māori Authorities and Te Tai Kaha, which I'm one of the advisors, on a workshop linked to the upcoming FOMA Business Summit. So I'm sounding like a bit of a marketer here. So all of you out there, make sure that you've enrolled. I really think that workshop is fundamental to explore some of the more difficult issues around engagement, how we set policy direction, how we ensure policy direction nationally is about protecting our obligations to Te Taiao and all of what's contained in Te Taiao, and including the obligations of Te Taiao to ensure our survivability. They have been asked to participate, that's MFE. I think it might be a baptism by fire for some of your workers, Martin, but I think you'll put up with it, to have a kanohi ki te kanohi engagement. And I really encourage people, if they haven't made time, the 15th of April is a must attend, particularly for iwi managers and iwi facilitators and kaitiaki of our taonga in this space. I hope that a link to the MFE consultation document, our future resource management system, developing the next stages, has been put on the FOMA website. I found that really helpful in preparing for today. And here I am hassling everybody again. Written submissions are due on the 23rd of April. I'm reminding you this week because it's Easter coming up, which means we've all got our whānau, so we can take time to do some template submissions, but also to really think about the interconnection, for example, between climate change adaptation, the National Planning Framework, infrastructural issues that Martin has talked about, and the carryover of existing obligations that we have really fought for in the resource management context. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Annette, mō tō kōrero hei hāpai te kaupapa nei. It's good to have had some time together, Iwama, to listen to Annette and also to hear from Martin with regards to Manatu mō te Taiao, the National Planning Framework. We have said that we will close at 1 o'clock. We've seen your questions and Joe has made attempts to respond to and answer them in real time. Annette and Martin have both talked about the FOMA Business Summit, which is being held on Friday the 14th and Saturday the 15th in Wellington at Te Wharewaka. Please feel free to join us there. We do have a session dedicated to resource management and resource management planning from a Māori and a FOMA perspective, and that's being led by our keynote, Dr. Mahina Arangi Baker. So I'd like to thank you all again, Martin Workman, Annette Sykes, Joe Begelhol, for sharing your insights, your experience and your knowledge so generously. FOMA is pleased and proud to be working alongside of Martin and the team at Manatu mō te Taiao with regards to this important piece of work. As Annette has said quite clearly, the focus for us is Ngai Tātou Te Iwi Māori me te Taiao, and we are always looking at the systems change necessary for us and for our Taiao. So Martin, thank you again for being part of this. I thank you also for making you and your team available for our workshop next week and for those conversations and discussions. Let me wish you all a very good afternoon. We're looking forward to seeing you online. We are looking forward to seeing your written submissions coming through, so just pushing that again, Iwama. and it behoves me now to close our hui and our webinar with the karakia ki nui tātou. Among atua me te waihi tātou waihi ngaro, tātou e tiaki e manaki, a kia ora anō tātou katoa.